So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Zoom program in January for the Garden Photographic Society. My name is Carlos Cardona. I'm the president. Today we have Hank Erdmann, who is going to be talking about, you know him, you love him, abstracts, abstracting nature in a photograph. Hank is an artist, author, professional natural history photographer, and photographic educator who resides in Will County. Hank's credits include hundreds of publications, periodicals, books, art exhibitions, numerous art shows, exhibits, one-person exhibitions. He's the former owner, member partner of Gallery 7 in Joliet. So without any further ado, let's go to Hank Erdmann for abstracting nature in a photograph.
Great. Yeah, Gallery 7's not in Joliet anymore.
I'm sorry, I'm going to mute all, and then Hank, unmute yourself.
All right, like I was saying, Gallery 7's not in Joliet anymore, and I'm not a member. But they're in Lockport now. They actually got asked to move into the Illinois State Museum property next to the Public Lending restaurant, or above it. So that's really cool. But I spent about 6.5 years working for Binny's as a wine consultant, my other interest. And I retired from that about 1.5 years ago. So I'm back to full-time photography. And I'm going to share my screen here. And we should be pretty good to go.
Looks good.
Okay. So long time ago, I've been a member of what used to be the Morton Arboretum Camera Club and now Mays Lake. God, since the early 80s, a long time. And one of the gentlemen that many of you probably know or know of, Bill Glass, who was working for the DNR and then one of the federal agencies, I can't remember which, before he retired. I still see Bill a lot, and we shoot together quite often. But Bill came running into a meeting holding up this pink covered book and saying, "You gotta see this." It was Freeman Patterson's photo impressionism and the subjective image. And at the time, I was in a real rut, and I don't know why, because I look back at that work now and it's okay. In fact, it's more than okay, but it did have a very similar mechanical structure to it. You know, back when we learned things that were called rules until we were smart enough to figure out they're not rules, they're guidelines, they're starting points. And it just opened a whole new world for me, and that was abstracts. And what it did even more than that is it when something in a traditional manner didn't work or wouldn't work, it gave you a choice other than to pull the tripod up and say, "I give up," which I don't like to do. So that's where this comes from. So this is an interesting shot. It's right in it's like 6.5 feet from my front door. I've got gardens all over our property, and this is a bed of black-eyed Susans. Of course, this is all planted with later photographs in mind. That's the best way of gardening. And this was 10 exposures layered on top of each other while moving the camera around. And I just like dreamy things like that. It gives you, it gives you an artistic release to say. So I guess the place to start is just what is an abstract. Way back when in college, I was taking a class, and a really good instructor. I really liked him a lot, but he was sort of peculiar. And I don't know. I must have, he was doing a section on abstraction, and I must have had a bored or confused look on my face, because he's walking around the class and he stops right next to me. And this isn't a big lecture with about 60 kids. And he goes, "What's the matter? You don't like abstracts?" And I looked at him trying to think of something to say. And I go, no, it's not that I don't like them. I don't get them. I don't get the idea. And he says, "That is your problem." He said, "Don't try to get it, appreciate it." And that really made me think. I said, yeah. At the time, he was showing a lot of Jackson Pollock's work. And I didn't get it. And when I stopped trying to get it, I got it. I really started to appreciate that type of imagery. So abstracts in photography, especially, are a lot of things to a lot of people. A lot of them different and not consistent in definition. So let's consult Mr. Webster. This is a shot I made very recently, this past November. That's done really well for me. And it's just one form of an abstract. It's a pretty simple one. And we'll talk about the various ways of making them in a minute. Let's talk about abstraction as an adjective. Existing in thought or as an idea, but not having a physical or concrete existence, a metaphor. If you're familiar with, and many people are, with the photographer, writer, artist, Guy Tal out of Utah, he talks about metaphor a lot. Or two relating to abstract art. Let's take a look at those. So this is a shot I did up in the UP, and on the road that goes past the parking lot to Big Island Lake. And the road kind of curves off to the left and goes into the forest. And it got dark, and I thought, oh, that's really cool. I shot some, straight shots of it. And all I had was this, this image of yellow fall colors and a big black hole. And I thought, well, that's kind of boring. And so I said, well, what if I layer the camera I was using at the time? I could layer 10 frames on a single exposure, and at the same time kind of twisted it back and forth to give it a rotational aspect. And that was the result. And I call this Into the Darkness. So it's a metaphor for something that could be dangerous or spooky, you name it. And then, relating to abstract art, I could see this image very easily being a painting. At the same time, it's got a hint as what it is, if you're familiar with lakes in fall colors that reflect fall color and birch trunks. But I don't think, at least I believe, that you wouldn't have to know that to appreciate it. Just hang this on the wall and it would look like an abstract painting, which I have no problem with, especially if somebody's purchasing it. We can look at abstraction as a verb, abstract something. Theoretically or separately, separating something from something else. We're extracting or removing something. We can abstract it. So this is a scene from last winter. I have a pretty cool forest preserve that's just 2 miles from my house called Hamel Woods. You would go past the edge of it if you went down I-55 just before getting off for Joliet and Shorewood on Route 52. And the entrance is off of 52 and Black Road. But this is along the edge of a little creek called Hamel Creek. And what caught my eye were these little, like, puffs, these little itty bitty mounds where the snow collected around offshoots of trees and things. And I just looked at that, and the first thing caught my eye were those little bumps, and then the shadows, and then the varying textures. So those were the things that caught my eye. So that's what I photographed. I eliminated or separated this stuff from everything else, or I abstracted it from the whole scene. The whole scene's pretty boring. This is up at Cantini Gardens in Winfield in DuPage County. They have a really neat, or did the time I was there, treatment for some of their formal gardens. They use Swiss chard as a border treatment. And I walked right past this. It was a fairly big planting of it, and paid no attention at all. And then kind of heard like a clacking sound where these big thick leaves were bouncing against each other, and turned around and saw them backlit. And all of a sudden, I was on this like white on rice. I mean, this is pretty cool. But again, I extracted it from the whole to make a much better image or statement. We can look at abstraction as a noun, an abstract. And that can mean a few different things, including the summary of contents of a book or an article, formal speech, or an abstract work of art. So in that context, I can summarize the milkweed plant by the cool stuff that we tend to see with the milkweed is the pod and the seeds, especially when it's got dew or water drops on it or frost on it. So that's an abstract. And then, making a photograph is purely just an abstract image that, is going to be hung on the wall. This was made the first year I was using digital. I took a long time to switch to digital because when I was still working commercial, I was working as a photographer at McDonald's Corporation, and we brought digital in. I helped bring that in there. Our first camera was a Sony digital camera and a Nikon N90 body, which was $9,000. And it was permanently magenta. Everything, no matter what we did to fix it, including sending it back to the factory, we couldn't get the magenta balance off things. So every image we shot, we had to balance for about a 15-unit magenta cast. It was a pain in the butt. So I was not really enamored with digital photography, but it's like anything else, when it's new, it's going to be inferior to what we've had 10 years later, or especially now. I wouldn't think of shooting film anymore. So anyhow, this was made, and it's an image. I've got a big 16 by 20 of this hanging in my hallway right outside my office door. And I would not have been able to do that if I'd shot this on film, because I wouldn't have seen the image on the back of the camera. So that, it's a great advantage. But I shoot a lot of water, a lot of moving water. I'm enamored by it. And I saw this almost immediately. I can kind of get a sense how foam dots or floating leaves or things are going to move through a scene at a given shutter speed. It's not absolute, but I've got a pretty good idea of it because I shoot a lot of this stuff. It's something that just floats my boat. So, we took this image. I kind of saw the foam dots at the top are barely moving. The ones going across the log were going a little bit faster. And the ones coming down along the side were moving pretty quick. So I had a pretty good idea of what this was going to look like, or pre-visualization of it. So I took the picture, and that little circular eddy current in the middle and the bottom third was smack dab in the middle of the image. And I will never say never with artistic things. I will never say never center something, because sometimes you should, sometimes it creates great symmetry, but more often it creates it kind of kills a composition. And in this one, it really did. It just that thing centered just killed the action of the feeling of it. So having an image look at the back, I said, oh, I could fix this. If I had to crop that off of a 35 millimeter slide, I would have ended up using, half the image size and probably not been able to print it much more than 8x10. So let's look at abstraction conceptually. And by the way, if anybody's got any questions, write them down, and we'll take care of them at the end. So a concept of existing as a thought or an idea, but not really having an existence of its own. Let's think about that. This was a shot back when I was teaching at the Arboretum. We had a class in the winter. We were out shooting in the morning, came back, we ended up the class, everybody's going home. And on my way out at the exit that goes southbound, or goes out to southbound Route 53, I see this great big group of people over by the DuPage River, the East Branch that flows through there. So I go, I'm going to go take a look at what they're looking at, and walked over there. And it was one of those typical Illinois things where you have a cold, then it warms up. In this case, we'd had a rainstorm as well. So the river had gotten up and high on the banks of the river. And as it came down, it created these icicles hanging off the edge of the river. And I see this rock in the side of the edge. This is not photoshopped in. This is a straight bare glass shot. And this rock was hanging there, just frozen on its side into the ice. This funny thing is I saw somebody come up behind me, but didn't think too much about it. And later saw almost that exact image in an art show. And it turns out a gentleman you probably have heard of, Josh Merrill, who I later got to know a little bit, was the guy that came up behind me and shot it too. And he had a black and white of it hanging in his art booth one year. So that kind of represents an idea of a floating rock, but it's not really floating. It's actually frozen to the ice. Abstract concepts such as love, beauty, truth, equality. Those are things that are kind of hard to photograph, as such, but we can take images and replicate those feelings or portray those feelings. This was a shot. We were down in Cades Cove, waiting for the gates to be opened at 8 o'clock. We got there early enough that we wanted to catch the first light because it had been a frosty autumn morning. And we just walked out in the field not too far from the visitor center and the entrance, and started shooting early until they opened the gate. But there's just a subtle and interesting beauty to this shot. This was made on film. And frankly, it's a bit of a mistake. I made the first few exposures, not thinking, trying to get something quick, relying too much on the meter, and then it said, "Oh, wait a minute! The meter's reading all that background light. It's going to blow this thing out of existence." And indeed, it did. But the images I compensated for the bright light and made what would be technically correct are worthless. But this thing's got life to it. I mean, it's just an image that I really, really loved, because the light was warm enough to get some warmth in there, but I was shooting into the shade, from the shade out to the brighter grasses, and it kind of combined those tones to just make the beauty of a grass field type of thing. Dealing with ideas rather than events. So I ran a little workshop and tour company for many years. And we did an annual Door County and winter tour for quite a while. And, you know, as a leader, you're supposed to get your clients in the good places, you know, get them the good pictures, help them out. So we go on this one farm that had been kind of abandoned. And one of the guys from one of my summer classes up there actually knew the owners and had gotten us permission to go in there. The lady was in assisted living, didn't live there anymore. And he said, you know, as long as you're not bothering, they don't care. Go with their blessings and shoot, which is really nice of them. Unfortunately, the place has been transformed. Somebody bought it and quote unquote fixed it up. Anyhow, had all these outbuildings, and they had these cranberry viburnum bushes that were just full of these berries. And it had snowed overnight just a little bit, and people are walking in to look at the barns and says, hey, get over here. You know, this is really cool. And there are 3 or 4 bushes, and I'm off on the left side, and I see the image on the left. And right away, I knew that was the image out of anything else in that string of bushes. And most of the folks were off on the right. So I quickly got this before I made everybody else aware of it. But the image on the right it's a decent shot. It's a kind of a document of snow-covered berries. The one on the left is a metaphor for the loner, the group protecting the single, you know, you name it. You can come up with just about any concept. But it's another concept that we talk about. I can't think of the term now. But you know, having that little added element. That shot without that berry hanging down is still a pretty good shot. But with the berry hanging down, it absolutely makes it. And over the years, that image has done extremely well for me. And I've got probably 25 variations of snow-covered berries from those bushes. And that's the one I constantly use, the one on the left. So again, when we can kind of get some conceptual stuff in, we get back into making images with feeling and emotion, and you know, more than just documents. Not based on a particular instance, theoretical. This is nothing more than a long exposure and holding the camera loosely and trying kinda to keep it steady, knowing it's going to move around because I want it to move around, versus taking it, shooting a frame, moving it just a little bit, shooting another frame, moving it just, you know, and doing that numerous times, you get an edginess to it. And it's not wrong or right, but it's different. And this one has a lot more fluidity to it because it's got some motion effects. And last, of a word, especially a noun, denoting an idea, a quality, or a state rather than a concrete object. So this is, I know most of you probably have heard the name Fred Drury. Fred was doing a semester-long class at College of DuPage for many years. And he played Tom Sawyer with his buddies. Where he'd ask us to come on and be a guest lecturer, and then we'd run a field session following it to follow up the lecture. And you know, it was like we were painting his fence like Tom Sawyer. But it was a lot of fun to do, and I just happened to catch a March date. March is not typically your greatest photographic month in Northern Illinois. I mean, it can be, but so, you know, I turned to abstract. So this is just an oak grove. And oaks have that propensity to, you know, they lack a cell at the end of their leaves. That's why those leaves hang on well into winter, if not into the following spring, because on leaves that have those cells, when those cells die, it makes the leaf easier to fall off. Well, so I looked at that and I said, we've got these neat semi-bright trunks and a bright overcast light, blue sky behind it. So I know we're going to get a warm, cool contrast. And just took in layered exposure upon exposure upon exposure on the same piece of, or not piece of film, but the same capture. And because my camera only will let me layer 10 frames on one capture, or 10 exposures on one capture, I did it 3 times and put them together in Photoshop to make this very textural, almost looking like pointillism, like that painting technique where you take a paintbrush and just a tip and just make gazillion little dots. Very similar feeling in this imagery. And again, this is, I think, probably the best one of a dozen or more attempts. And we just we're standing in the parking lot of Fullersburg Woods, photographing these tree trunks in leftover leaves, and just having a blast do it. That was, you know, a very successful class. People had fun. And they learned something, and I learned something. In many, not all, in many of my own images, in my own abstracts, I like to have what I call a hint of reality in the image. Again, we don't need understanding. I don't have to get it, as that professor said. But I think it does help sometimes to kind of hone in the image, or get a little bit of a better feeling for it for the viewer, especially if they're not a photographer, if they're not an artist. So this is a fairly typical shot. Everybody and their cousin that have shot fall colors on a lake has done something like this, where you abstract it, one, by getting, you know, completely eliminating the shoreline, and getting enough depth of field that, so I would say 2/3 of the not water lilies, the can't think of the name of the plant. The plants in the water, water shields. Why couldn't I think of that? The most of the water shields are sharp enough for what I need, and I intentionally left the reflections. Now, if I wanted the reflections, it would be like shooting a landscape. You'd want to stop it way down and kind of figure out, you know, your depth of field in that zone. From where to where do I have to have it focused? In this case, I'd have to have had it in those front water shields, which were, oh geez, a good 60, 70, 80 yards out in front of me. They're well out in the lake. It's shot with a longer lens. To infinity would have had to been my depth of field if I wanted everything sharp. Of course, there's water movement, there's wind, and all this other stuff. That wasn't going to happen. And that's one reason I thought about, let's do it this way. I'm going to let those birch trees blur, but I don't want to really do it with blurring by water movement, because then my water shields won't be sharp. So I wanted some sense of a definition or sharpness in the water shields, but I wanted the fall colors and the birch trunks soft, so I used shallow depth of field. A lot of this stuff is just sitting there and figuring it out, and, you know, playing around with it. And again, the great value with digital, so we can look at the back of the camera and say, yeah, that's what I wanted, or no, it's not what I wanted, or no, it's not what I thought I'd get, but it's pretty damn cool. It's a great tool. And on and off, I've also played with image montages, another way of making abstract images. So this is an interesting image because it's got one shot that's a sunrise view off of a bluff over the Wisconsin River out of Wyalusing State Park in southwestern Wisconsin. And the other image, I don't even know if I remember which one it was. It was a sunset of some kind. And the way it came together is it's obviously trees, but there are ridge lines of trees at the top that look a whole lot more like clouds. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. So, and this is just a process of going into Photoshop and taking two images and putting them on layers and then playing around with how you combine them. I mean, the sky's the limit. It's a great way to waste a couple days. I shouldn't say waste, to spend a couple days and have a little fun. Especially on a wet, cold January day when it's raining. There's no images to be made. So let's talk about some techniques for doing this stuff. Let's talk about in the field and then again in the studio. There's a lot of abstracts that for me are just straight shots that have been very selectively cropped. So we're thinking about terms of optical extraction, selectivity, crop, simplifying, abridged, condensed, edited, pick the word you like. Here's that border treatment of Swiss Chardigan. As I'm turned around and am mesmerized with these backlit leaves, especially in the red, they say red and green are Christmas colors. They're definitely Christmas colors for the photographer. I don't know that if I've seen red and green in nature and not been able to find an image. It's almost absolute. And it was a fairly bright morning. You'll notice what looks like some raindrops in a couple of the leaves. Well, they're not raindrops. The sprinkler had gone off about a half hour before this. So some of the drops were still wet. So it added another little layer of texture in there. But I just love this image and just the way it looks like I put it through some kind of filter in Photoshop or some kind of treatment. Again, it's straight glass. I've done nothing to this except tone down the highlights a little bit and pop the vibrance just a little bit. I mean, this would have been really easy to go way too far with. And I wouldn't even think of using a saturation adjustment on it, which is something I almost don't use at all anymore. Focus, a lot of things we can do, and you'll see a lot of really creative flower photography done this way, using very soft focus elements. And I'm sitting in the parking lot of a place called The Clearing. It's what they call a folk school up in Door County in Ellison Bay, where I have taught for, this will be the 29th year I'm teaching, the 30th year I've been up there. I missed a year for COVID. They had to shut it down for COVID. But this is on the edge of the parking lot. And it was actually up in the air because they have some stone border treatments. So I didn't even have to get down on my chest and lay in the dirt to do this, but this is moss shot extremely close. It's close to 1:1, selecting a very singular focus point, which is surprisingly hard to do. And as my eyesight gets older, like with most of us, it gets even harder to do. So what I ended up doing is I shot probably a dozen or two frames, just barely tweaking the focus in and out, so it would land in different planes. Shot not quite wide open. I think it was probably around f4 or something like that. and just getting this edge of sharpness in there. And I went through all those 20 shots or whatever and picked out the one or two that I like best. So soft focus can be really, really creative things. It can be really dreamy. You can do mostly soft focus with just a couple key elements. This is over at the tulip farm, Veldeer Tulip Farm in Holland, Michigan, actually just north of Holland in Ottawa County. And it's neat because they have long beds of tulips, and so there'll be bands of color, and you can create just about anything you can think of. So I'm looking at these yellow tulips and looking at them fairly close and noticing they've got red edgings, and I look up and the border of the tulips behind them just happen to be red, and I'm going, aha, duplicate or replicate the red. That works really well. And that's what I got. Playing around with various depths of field, it can create these kind of things. This is one where I couldn't quite get what I wanted. So I needed to use a little bit more depth of field than I really wanted. And the background was by no means sharp, but it wasn't soft enough. And today I would do this much differently. I would use focus slices and I can get exactly what I want. But this was shot on film. So what I did was I did a technique where you're layering exposures on one piece of film. So the first shot was focused on the front grasses. The second shot was focused on the middle grasses. And then I threw the thing completely out of focus and took a third exposure. This is all again on the same frame of film. And that's what I got. I figured out to get close to what I wanted. Completely soft focus. And this we were talking before the show started. This is one I will admit is a mistake. It's a cool mistake. So I had a class at the Arboretum and I was demonstrating, it was a close-up class, and was demonstrating how to use 2-element diopters instead of, going out and buying a very expensive macro lens. It was an intro class. And that's why we're focused on using some less expensive gear. I am so enamored still, and I've been using them for 30 some years, 2-element diopters, that I don't own a macro lens right now. And I shoot a lot of close-ups. I get everything I need with 2 sets of diopters, 2-element diopters. So anyhow, I said, oh, you can even, this is a black-eyed Susan, which in reality is the size a little bit bigger than a silver dollar, maybe an 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 in diameter in reality. And it was growing at the edge of a forest area. So it really wasn't growing where it's supposed to be, but it was an escape or something. And it shot up this really tall stalk. I don't think I've ever seen a black-eyed Susan that looked like this. So I was demonstrating, how do you deal with a situation like this? And I wanted to shoot something that was close to 1:1 or full frame. And that's about what this is. And I wanted one sharp point of focus. And that green subleaf or leafette, whatever you call it, on the left, the most pointed one, that's what I wanted sharp. And I had it focused sharp. And I was using 2 2-element diopters stacked on top of each other to get really close with a 70 to 300 zoom, pretty much out to 250, 260, somewhere in there, to get what I wanted. And through the viewfinder, it was fine. Sadly, I'm in a class, I can't really take the time to sit there and make this happen. So I took a couple frames. It was a demonstration, not much more than that. And I actually had a clamp on the, the Wimberley clamp, the PLAMP, the device that goes around a flower stalk to hold it still. I actually had a clamp on this thing and it was still moving a little bit. And I kind of knew after, I couldn't take more than 4 or 5 frames because I was in the middle of a class. And so I pulled it apart and packed up, and demonstrations done. And I kind of knew that it was still moving. And I got the slides back. And I was so not distraught, but saddened that none of them were sharp. And I actually threw the slide kind of madly on the light table and said, not what I wanted. And it landed upside down, which made it more abstract. And I started looking at it. I said, I really like the color in there. And that dark spot's big enough to look intentional. And it was intentional. So I said, this is back when I was in the gallery. I said, what the heck, I'm going to print this. And I printed it small, about 8 by 10, put it in a frame and put it out on the floor. And a week later it sold. And I go, hey, that's kind of cool. So I printed another one and then it sold. I ended up selling a half a dozen of these things. So go figure. But, technically it's a mistake, but I could actually see doing something like that intentionally because it's a decor piece. And that doesn't insult me at all. Somebody wants to use my work as a decor item, God bless them. If they're going to pay for it, I'm more than happy to do it. And then we can have soft focus or softness due to, we had completely soft focus. We can also have softness due to motion. And that's currently a really big thing. And I'll show that in a second. This was actually a shot from the very first session after I bought a digital camera to use myself. Not the first one I took for corporate work, and we were at a little preserve across from Stateville Prison in Will County, just north of Joliet, along Route 53. It's Lockport Prairie Forest Preserve. It was a huge cattail field that surrounds the wet dolomite prairie there. And a buddy of mine, Ken Thompson, who also does close-up workshops with us when we're doing it, they are. And excuse me, Ken had parked his car to the west of the railroad tracks that run through the eastern part of the preserve. And I had stopped because I saw him and was on the western side of those tracks. And then a freight train came through. And then it stops. And I looked at Ken and his car's on the other side of the freight train. And this thing isn't moving. And we're waiting and waiting. 15 minutes later, it hasn't moved yet. I'm going, well, Ken, it's been good seeing you. I'll see you later. No, I didn't do that. We actually saw a sign along the track that had a telephone number for the yard guy. And he called it up and he actually got somebody. He said, can you move your train? And they did. Took a while. But so anyhow, I've got this camera. It's a windy day on a prairie. The only reason I actually went is I said I will be there back in the days before we all had cell phones. And so I showed up and I figured, well, I'm not going to get anything decent, but here's a good time to learn to use this camera. I mean, it was a Nikon, but when switching from film, all of a sudden you had to deal with menus instead of just dials. So it was a learning experience. And this was actually shot with a forest on the top of it. And I started looking at this and I'm going, I kind of like the movement in this. So same thing happened. I cropped the top off, made it into a panel format, not a true panel, but made it into that size relationship. Printed one, put it in a small frame, put it in the gallery, and it sold. And I continued to sell some of them. So again, never say never. And that's the fun of this stuff. You take something whimsical, and you make it so that it looks that it's totally intentional. And that's what you wanted to do. And it works quite well. So we can have movement of subject. This is another abstraction of autumn color reflected in lake, completely cropping out the shoreline. And this time there's no water shields in the water or lilies or anything. It's just the reflection. And there was a little bit of wind movement. And I sat there and thought, I want to make something dreamy here. I'm gonna, I could probably, because I didn't worry about depth of field in the reflected sky. You're not going to know if that's sharp or not because there's no clouds in it. But I figured if I really wanted to, I could probably, back then we were, it was again film shot, we're shooting Fuji Velvia. I could probably push this to 100 and get enough depth of field to get most of it sharp. And I started playing around with that and I go, wait a minute, that's the essence of this is the beautiful blending of the colors when the water moves. And it wasn't moving a lot, it was just moving a little bit. So I figured out a shutter speed, somewhere around a 15th that would allow a little mixing, but still get the hint of some textures that are back in here. And I have a 16 by 20 of this frame that I hang up in the fall. It's just an image that makes me feel good. It's fun playing with this kind of thing. I was up in Canada with Fred, photographing a very cool place called Lake Superior Provincial Park. And we're photographing fall colors reflected in the water. And a fish rose to take a bug or something and created these concentric circles. Like, oh, that's cool. And it was right in where the best reflections were. And so I said, oh, I got to do that. And I looked at another place where a fish rose. And by the time I got it framed up and got the depth of field figured out, the waves, the little rings were gone. So I finally got good enough at it to get a setting. So I'm pretty sure everything would be in focus that I wanted. And then the fish stopped rising where I wanted them to with the best reflections. So I said, I grabbed a little pebble off the shore, threw it in the water just outside of the frame and created my own fish ripples. So this fall, we're on the in Solmo Creek in DuPage County at Waterfall Glen. Bill Glass and I are out shooting, and I saw a reflection. I thought that would be really neat to do again. Sorry. And I'm making these images and they're doing what I want them to do. And I'm going, been there, done this. I it's just not giving me what I want feeling wise because I've done it before. So I said, well, same setup. Let's do something a little differently. Let's really slow it down and see what we get. And that is what I got. It's a much dreamier, much different image. Same kind of thing. I'm using water movement to create the movement in the image, but this was something new and different. So it pays to play. It pays to experiment. I guess I'm not afraid of repeating something that worked well, but I just felt like there was something more there. Wind movement, another great thing. Photographing around prairies and the Great Lakes shores, which are two of my primary loves. You either learn to deal with the wind or you get very frustrated. And when I was starting out, I would just get very frustrated because I didn't have this tool, the tool of abstraction in my toolbox. I would never even have thought of doing something like this. Back in the day, especially in camera club photography, if it wasn't tack sharp edge to edge and there was a flower in the picture, except for the background, it was no good. And there are days out on a prairie that I don't care how patient you are. The wind's just not going to start blowing. You're not going to get a sharp image unless the wind changes. And I have very much learned to not worry about that. Take what Mother Nature is giving you, thank her for the gift, and make something exciting. There's camera movement, and this has become a big thing. It's not that it hasn't been done before. It's been going on for a long time. Patterson talks about that in his book, but now it's really caught on. So this is again from that workshop I did with Fred's class. 2 sycamore trees, moving the camera up and down and just streaking these things. Kind of fun to do. This is very recently. We were out in San Francisco. We had done my first ever trip to Yosemite, which was very cool, but it was more a some of our best friends and us going out there. We went to Yosemite. I did a little shooting. We did a lot of sightseeing. Then we went to Sonoma. We drank a little wine. We drank a lot of wine. And then we went down to San Francisco for a few days. And this is at Baker Beach, famous beach in San Francisco, on, you know, what was a bright, bald blue, awful sunny day. But when we went down to the shore, the mist moved in. And I thought, good, but then it was just so flat. I said, okay, I'm going to play around with it. Back a dozen years ago or so, my wife had a conference, an educators conference in Boston, and I had a ticket I had to use. So I tagged along and I just walked all over Boston for 4 days taking pictures, which was just a lot of fun, and going in galleries and things like that. And I walked in this one gallery, and this guy had done these horizontal camera movement shots of shorelines that just blew me away. And I've been trying to do something similar since, and I haven't succeeded. Someday I'll get there. So this was a poor attempt at doing that. Kind of got the feeling it's just that the colors aren't right. You know, it's hard to do anything with UV light brown. It's a pretty ugly color. Another camera movement where I'm actually taking, and I forget, I couldn't make the tripod work. So I just figured out eventually how to turn the camera, and with enough attempts, I could keep the centered, so I would get this spiral effect. I don't know if that's great. I've seen some good examples of this. It's a learning tool. It's a learning process. You play with it more, you eventually figure it out. Excuse me. So in the last year or so, I have found this site on Facebook. It's called the ICM, or Intentional Camera Movement magazine. It's a group, and I have never posted anything on there. Someday I probably will, when I feel I've got something good enough. But I just love the imagery that's being shown on this site. And more than that, it's giving me ideas. And it's not that, oh, I'm going to go replicate that. Oh, but I like that motion. I like that movement. I'll find something to apply it to. It gives you ideas. And I'll have the address to that in the notes. Most of the time, maybe 99's a little bit high, but it's up in the high 90s. I like to match the flow of movement, meaning if it's a vertical subject, it seems to me that vertical movement's going to work a lot better. I'm not talking about the frame, I'm talking about the motion. I've also found horizontal movement to be really difficult to make work for some reason. And maybe I'm just not doing it right. This is one from this past summer that is better. I still haven't really feel that I've nailed this. I just got to play with it more. Multiple images. Another thing I really like to do in camera. So back in the day, this is shot on film. If you have ever read Outdoor Photography magazine, the guy does the tech tip column, George Lepp. He's done a lot of seminars and stuff. He's been in Chicago many times. Always puts on a great show. I don't think he's doing those anymore, but I think he's still writing the column. But he used to have this neat little magazine he produced. It was all published in black and white. And in one of them, he talked about this technique of layering multiple exposures on one frame of film. This was shot on my old Nikon F3. And the way you did that, I mean, the later cameras, the I don't know about the F4, but certainly the F5 and F6, they had a button in there where you could do multiple exposures really easy. But back on this camera, you had to figure out the exposure yourself. You didn't have the technology that does it today. You don't have to figure out how much each exposure has to be. This one I had to figure out, if I wanted 4 exposures, how much each of those exposures would be to equal one correct exposure. And it's not that hard to do, but you work backwards. And it's basically, I did 4 exposures that were 3/4 of a stop underexposed, so that 4/4 equal 1. So I figured that out. And the reason was I was sitting on the mountainside on a workshop a long time ago with John Fielder, great 4x5 shooter, guy I was really enamored with, and a really good teacher. And we're taking a break, and I see these flowers off we're sitting out in a sunlit field or off of a trail, and these are in kind of a little swale. They're in the shade. And I could see right away that the green in the shade had gone that nice blue green from being UV shade. And I thought, that's really cool with those purple mountain daisies and the red Indian paintbrush. So I set this up. I figure out that I probably can get front to back sharp at f/22 and take a couple frames, and then said, you dummy. And this is, we didn't have pictures on the back of the cameras then. I just knew that at f/22, my background, which is only 1.5 feet, 2 feet behind my subject, it's not going to be sharp, but it's not going to be soft enough. In fact, it's going to be really distracting. And I looked through, the depth of field preview, and sure enough, it was, there was no frame there was no picture there. It wasn't working. And I actually started to pull the tripod out of there, kind of cursing under my breath, saying, we really want that picture. And then I remembered this technique that Lepp had talked about in his little magazine. So you photographed, you put 1/4 of your exposure on that first flower, focus there. Then you would press the rewind button on the bottom of the camera and advance do the film advance. So it would recock the shutter, but it wouldn't advance the film. Focus in on the second flower, do the same thing. Focus in on the next set of flowers, do the same thing, and then do the last one at the top. And the purple one and way in back, I said, I'm not gonna worry about that. It's gonna be a nice little blur. And it turned out exactly as I wanted. And this is one of my best-selling prints. I've got one hanging in my living room in the summer usually. It's just a neat, dreamy little image. And it worked perfectly. Well, long story short, today it's super easy to do this. You dial everything up, you set the parameters, you set how many frames you want to put on one exposure or one frame. or how many exposures you want in one frame. You set it for auto gain, so you don't have to figure out the exposure. It does it for you. Cameras are wonderful. This is a handheld shot. Again, trying to replicate that painting technique of pointillism on film. I call this two trees. And we were just having a blast doing this. This was in a photo tour that we ran up to UP, just having fun playing around. And then there are montages. You can do them in camera. And this is a mistake. I got to fix the slide. I completely forgot that I added some of this stuff on montages back in November. And of course, I duplicated something and didn't fix all of it. It is 2 exposures. This is actually fairly hard to do. So I eyed an image in my front yard garden of these purple things, the sedum. And then I ran around into the backyard really quick and framed up the second frame, which is the coleus, these things in here, and layered them in equal exposures. Now, I don't know if that works or not, but it gives you the idea of doing it. But it's really hard to do logistically. I mean, Freeman Patterson talks about how he layered one shot of sunrise, and I don't know if it was a day or a couple days later, layered a second frame in it later. Well, who's got that many cameras laying around that you can take and hold an exposure in waiting for days at a time and then go add something to it? That's where it's much easier to put them together in post after the fact. So I will write down quite often. I'll make a note that says, okay, I shot this image for later use with something else or with a specific image that I might have in mind. And sometimes I'll just sit there and look through, screen after screen after screen of images and say, I wonder if this would go with that, that kind of thing. So montages, I think, are a little easier to do in the studio. This first shot is a shot of plantain. I think it's plantain. It's actually an exotic, doesn't belong here. This is down in Medewa National Tallgrass Prairie. I just love the thick, leafy, the textures of this stuff. And I have that shot. And then I shot this in my backyard. These are wild geraniums that I have a lot of mixing of things like hosta and cinnamon ferns that I've planted within. I've got a remnant piece of forest in my backyard. Small, but it's nonetheless a bunch of oak trees. Used to be a lot of ash trees too, but they all went the way of the emerald ash borer. So anyhow, I've got these native flowers, and when they kind of die back in late spring, early summer, I whack them back. They come back the next year, no problem. And I've planted things within them so that they'll combine. So this is a yellow-leafed hosta that came up with these geranium leaves. And I'm thinking that this is going to be pretty cool with this. It'll put a yellow spot in there. It did, but I was surprised at how much the cinnamon fern showed up. I really like that. I think I like that more than the other two by themselves. So sometimes they really work well when you play around with this, and sometimes they don't. The ones that don't, you won't see. They go to the old delete file. So this is an image. I'm not sure to this day why I kept it. It's one of those things you make and you go, it's not film. I'm not throwing bad slides into landfills. I'm not wasting anything. I'm experimenting with my time. And it sat in a file and I didn't do anything with it, obviously. And this is an image that I like, but I wish it had some color in it. And I'm playing around one day and I said, I wonder if that sumac color will do anything with this. And indeed, it does. It does some nice things with it. I was very, very pleased with that. Much more than either of the other two. So that's just, again, look around, seeing what will work with something else. Or you can take an image and flip it 180 degrees and then combine it with itself and create ice teeth. Again, playing around is fun. And then, again, I kind of scoff, especially me at cell phone cameras. When people would show up in classes with one, we'd say, yeah, that's not going to quite work. But again, we didn't realize how good they were going to get. I have lots of images on my website now that were made with my iPhone. And shortly I'm going to be getting the new 14 because it's really exceptional. I know a couple of guys that have them and I'm just blown away with what they're doing with them. But there are all these different apps that you can get. And I'm sure I just dropped the mouse. I'm sure that many of you know about this, but here's some that I've discovered so far. And Jerry Hugg is right. The best camera is the one you got with you, and you always have your cell phone with you. So this is one called Waterlog. Years ago, I had a program, Corel Photo Draw, that I really loved, and they had a really nice watercolor conversion filter. And then I had a computer wipe out, and somehow I lost that, or maybe the copy I had was no longer supported. I forget what the deal was. So I lost the ability to do that. And then I found Waterlog, which is it turns an image into a watercolor in effect. And I don't want to insult watercolorists, because there was a time I wanted to be one. It's kind of how I got into photography. I found out I can't paint. But this is a really ugly photograph. It's of 2 allium, and I've got a lot of bark compost in the garden beds, and just a straight shot on the cell phone that I took to try this out is something you probably wouldn't even show anybody. It's pretty ugly. Put it through this Waterlog app. That's kind of cool. So, again, sky's the limit with this stuff. You can get really creative and make some neat images. This is another one, Distressed FX. This is the shot as made in the iPhone. This is I've improved it in Photoshop. Better, but not really that good. So this is the improved image, and then this is running it through Distressed FX. And again, I don't know what it is. It's not really nature. It's nature inspired maybe, but that's kind of cool. It's definitely a different look. I was out in Utah for not the first time I've been to Utah, but get out of there. Get out of here. There. I was out in Utah with Don Carter this past June, the first photo trip I'd done out there. And we were in a parking lot, and these ravens came up looking for handouts, of course. And they're pretty patient, even though we weren't giving them anything. So this one's sitting on the car door, and I took a snap of it. And I said, it's completely backlit. I know it. But I guess somewhere, somehow, sometime, I'll be able to do something with that. And then when I started working on this program, which I had an abstract show, but it was all slides and it hadn't been redone in 12, 15 years. So I redid it in anticipation of a class I did for the clearing in their workshop program. They're just 2-day workshops this summer. So I took that and ran that image into distressed FX, and it gives that bird a whole, it's kind of a eerie feel. I kind of like that. Come on, advance. Why is this not going? Something, oh, there it goes. And then, of course, you can combine all these things. Any of these techniques can be used with any other one. Like I said, the sky is the limit. Something I have been photographing basically since I picked up a camera. For some reason, leaves really intrigue me. The veining of them, the coloring of them. It's just something that I am attracted to. Usually quite closer than this, but not always. So we're up in Door County, Bill Glass and I last winter, shooting just everywhere, just going around taking pictures. And Door County has a really neat group of people, an organization called the Land Trust. And they save property. They put them, they either, if they have to, they help buy things to preserve them. Most of the time they work with conservation easements. And there's this one really neat preserve called Hines Creek that I've been through in the fall and the summer. I won't go there in the summer again. It's mosquito heaven, but the fall's pretty cool. And we went in there in the winter, and it's these very tannin laden creeks. They come out of cedar swamps, so they got all the tannins in the water. And this is actually a cropped shot. I cropped the top of it off. I couldn't get what I wanted in the frame, and it needed this kind of cropping. So when I shot it, I knew I would crop it. And it's in the shade. So again, you're picking off all this UV light, turning the bright tan back of these leaves, the maple leaves, into this blue. And the tannin on the browner, I don't know if they're beech or ironwood, something like that. The brown leaves had a magenta cast to them. And yeah, I tweaked this a little bit. I pumped it up a little bit with vibrance. Again, I just don't use saturation. I don't like it. But I pumped this up a little bit. This is really what I saw, this blue against maroon. And again, I wanted a straightforward shot. These are underwater. And if I shot it really slow, because I wanted that feeling of the water, you can see it over here. It just blurred everything out. So I shot it at a much faster shutter speed, just slow enough to get some water movement. Didn't quite get out what I want, but still I like this shot a lot. So again, it's looking at something, saying, okay, what is this literally? And then what can I do with it? How can I treat it? How can I do something different? How can I bring out, I pay a lot of attention to first impressions, things I think about when I look at something and it catches my eye. I pay attention to that. So first of all, I am looking at it. And then I think, okay, why did it catch my eye? Is it the color? Is it the shape? Is it something else? And that's how I key into some of those images. In the studio, again, I mean, you could spend days upon days upon days doing this. This was shot, again, having been a commercial photographer and having all the hot lights and this and that. I don't use the hot lights much anymore. I've gotten rid of them. I still use my strobes, but I don't use the strobes because I hate strobe light. I use the modeling lights on them, and they're wonderful. And I don't have to go out and buy new ones. And I use a lot of window light. I like window light photography. But these are just store-bought flowers. Go to the Jewel, go to Mariano's, wherever, buy a bunch of flowers for $3.99, and you'll get a couple days out of them, doing everything to the sun under them, and some things they probably don't like. I talked about my time as a wine consultant. So I've got lots of corks. Just about anything you can think of will make a interesting subject for an abstract. Oh geez, at least 12, 15 years ago, I saw an image in Sierra Club engagement calendar of some neat flowers encased in ice by a Canadian photographer named Daryl Goulin. And I'm going, oh, is that cool? And how did he do that? You know, how did he get ice with those flowers? You know, and it's the old story, be there at the right time. Well, then I found out, and I also found out that Sierra Club Books wasn't real happy with him because he portrayed that as real. And it did the same thing I did here, but not as well. He took store-bought flowers and put them in a pan and put water in there and put them in the freezer. Neat technique. I'm still playing with that because it's got a cool look to it. Light level, luminosity, all kinds of things. This is a shot I did during the class when I was demonstrating some of the things that you can do. So I have a bunch of light tables from my slide days. Fortunately, I've kept most of them, especially the small ones. And you can take them and do really neat things with photographing flowers and other subjects, especially translucent subjects on them. So this is, we're playing around making patterns with flower petals. That's what the maroon or red ones are in the back. And I thought that was pretty cool. And then I took a full flower and put it on top of there. Oh, that's kind of cool. And then I thought, what if we wet them down? We've got a spray bottle. And it didn't really work. One, it moved them around a little bit. I just didn't like the look of it. So I thought about it. So I set up again and pulled a bunch more petals apart, put that flower in there, and then put a piece of glass over the top of it with some spacers. So it's not sitting on top of this thing, crunching it, and sprayed the glass. And that turned out really neat. Again, sky is the limit. If you can think it, you can create a completely unique and different image. And you can play with direct lighting or bounce lighting, fill lighting, color lighting, just about anything you can think of. This is a close-up of a store-bought flower with a light in a softbox above it. And the bottom was just too dark. It just went black. So I took an old piece of mat board, because I got all that stuff, slid it underneath it at an angle and just bounced enough light to put some detail in here and create a gradation. This is another image that's done really well for me. Resources. Well, first of all, the book I first mentioned, the original had a pink cover. I don't know what happened to my original copy. It got lent to somebody in a class somewhere and sadly never came home, but it's still in print. And that's what it looks like now. If I were to buy one book on this subject, it would probably be this one. Freeman Patterson's a pretty special guy. He's up in New Brunswick, Canada. Just an incredible person and an incredible photographer. Tony Sweet, who's a former magician, a former musician, and a bunch of other neat things, has done some books on this kind of work. They're both quite good. This is one I just bought last summer for that class, because I'd seen a lot of Harold Davis's work, and I've got a few of his other books. This book itself is fairly new. Another one that there's so many ideas in here. And I need to get back to playing with that kind of stuff. It's fun. Great thing worth the purchase. And then Charles Needle is doing a lot of teaching all over the country, and he does a lot of the same stuff. Another book well worth its purchase. Those are the few that I rely on mostly. and then all of Guy Tal's books for inspiration in, thought process and thinking about how to put myself and emotion and feeling into images and make them more than documents.